Picture this. You stand on the edge of a Norwegian fjord in late October. The year is 952. Behind you, wooden longhouses cluster against the mountainside, their turf roofs already dusted with the season's first snow. Before you, the pewter gray sea churns beneath a sky that grows darker each day, the sun sliding ever lower on the horizon until it will barely rise at all. You are a Viking, though you would never call yourself that. To you, you are simply Norse, a farmer and occasional raider, and right now you face an enemy more terrifying than any Saxon shield wall or Frankish cavalry. Winter is coming, and with it, the very real possibility that you and everyone you love will starve to death before spring. This is not metaphor. This is not exaggeration. For the Norse people of Scandinavia, winter was an annual siege that lasted 5 to 6 months, a time when the earth froze solid as iron, when fishing became impossible, when even the hardy sheep and cattle you'd raised all summer began to die despite your best efforts. The Vikings, those legendary warriors who struck fear into the hearts of medieval Europe, spent half their lives fighting a battle far more desperate than any raid, the battle to simply eat. What they consumed during those long, dark months was a testament to human ingenuity, desperation, and the thin line between survival and death. It was food that would make most modern people retch. Food that could poison you. Food that was, quite literally, rotting or fermented to the edge of toxicity. And yet it was this food, this carefully curated collection of preserved, pickled, and potentially deadly sustenance, that allowed the Norse culture to not just survive, but thrive in one of the harshest environments humans have ever called home. The Viking relationship with food was fundamentally different from ours. We open refrigerators stocked with fresh produce from across the globe. We microwave meals that would have seemed like sorcery to them. We waste more food in a week than a Norse family might see in a month. But for them, every bite of food represented someone's labor, someone's skill, and someone's gamble that they'd preserved enough to last until the ice broke and the seas opened again. To understand Viking winter cuisine is to understand desperation refined into art, necessity transformed into culture, and the remarkable capacity of humans to eat almost anything if survival demands it. It's also to understand that many of the foods that kept them alive would be classified as hazardous by modern health standards. The irony is stark. They had to risk poisoning themselves to avoid starving. Before we journey into the cold larders and smokehouses of Norse winter, we need to understand what was at stake. The Norse inhabited lands where winter meant not just cold, but a fundamental transformation of the world. In places like Iceland, northern Norway, and Sweden, winter days shrank to a few hours of twilight. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing and stayed there for months. The sea, their highway and grocery store during warmer months, became either too dangerous to navigate or simply froze solid. Archaeological evidence from sites like Jorvik in England and Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, combined with the wealth of Norse sagas and poems, gives us a remarkably clear picture of their struggle. The Havamal, that collection of Viking wisdom poetry, doesn't waste time on abstraction when it comes to food. It states plainly, better a living guest than a fame-seeking hero. The living can eat. Even their poetry was pragmatic about survival. The Norse farming calendar was brutal in its efficiency. Spring planting happened the moment the ground thawed enough to break with an iron plow. Summer was for growing, fishing, raiding, and trading. Autumn was harvest, an all-consuming frenzy where every person from children to elders worked to bring in crops and prepare for the darkness. And then came winter, when all that mattered was whether you'd done enough. Failure meant death, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete reality. The sagas are full of passing references to harsh winters where people starved, where entire settlements disappeared, where families made terrible choices about who would eat and who would not. The Landnámabók, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, casually mentions winters where many starved, as if this were as inevitable as rain. So what did they eat? How did they preserve it? And why might it kill you? The answers involve fermented shark that reeks of ammonia, fish soaked in lye until it becomes gelatinous, blood sausages stuffed with suet and oats, soured milk so thick you could cut it with a knife, and meat so heavily salted it could preserve itself for years, but might also preserve you, pickled from the inside out. This is not a story of Viking feasts in great halls, mead flowing and meat roasting. Those existed, but they were the exception, brief islands of abundance in a sea of scarcity. This is the story of everyday survival, of the meals that kept the Norse alive when the world froze and the darkness fell. It's a story of remarkable ingenuity and terrible risk, of foods that sustained a culture and foods that sometimes killed them. The Vikings didn't conquer the North Atlantic because they were braver or stronger than other peoples, though they were certainly both. They conquered it because they learned to eat in ways that would make other cultures recoil in disgust. They learned to trust fermentation processes that looked and smelled like rot. They learned to consume every part of every animal, including parts we'd rather not discuss. They learned, in short, to survive on the edge of the possible. As we journey through their winter larders, prepare yourself. Some of what you're about to learn will fascinate you. Some will disgust you. And some will make you grateful beyond measure for modern refrigeration, safety standards, and the ability to order fresh food at any time of year. But all of it will show you what humans are capable of when survival is the only goal that matters. The darkness is falling. The first snows are beginning. The harvest is either in or it isn't. There's no going back now, no second chances, no backup plan. There is only what you've stored, what you've preserved, and what you're willing to eat to see another spring. Welcome to a Viking winter. Try not to die of food poisoning. To understand Viking winter food, you must first understand the terror of autumn. For the Norse, September and October weren't seasons of cozy sweaters and pumpkin spice. They were a race against death, a desperate scramble to gather, process, and store enough food to last until April or May. Every farmer, every household, every community faced the same brutal mathematics. Estimate wrong, and you'll be eating leather and bark by February. Estimate right, and you might actually survive. The Norse agricultural system was a study in efficiency born of necessity. Unlike their counterparts in warmer Europe, Scandinavian farmers couldn't rely on mild winters or early springs. They knew, with grim certainty, that by late October the ground would freeze solid and remain that way until April. No midwinter hunting expeditions. No fresh vegetables growing under snow. No popping down to the market for supplies. What you had in storage was what you had, period. The primary crops were barley and oats, hardy grains that could mature in the short northern growing season. Rye and wheat were cultivated in more southern regions, but in Norway, Iceland, and northern Sweden, barley reigned supreme. It grew fast, tolerated cold better than wheat, and could be used for everything from bread to porridge to beer. A successful barley harvest could mean the difference between a household that thrived and one that buried children before spring. Archaeological excavations at Norse farms reveal the scale of their grain storage. At sites like Stong in Iceland, researchers found evidence of massive underground storage pits lined with stone and wood. These weren't small root cellars. Some were large enough to hold tons of grain, carefully sealed to keep out moisture and vermin. The Norse understood that grain could keep for years if properly stored, a hedge against the inevitable bad harvest. But grain alone wouldn't sustain them. The Norse diet relied heavily on animal products, meat, fish, milk, and blood. This meant that autumn was also slaughter season. This wasn't casual butchering. This was calculated culling based on cold mathematics. How many animals could you feed through winter? How many were old, weak, or unlikely to survive regardless? How much meat did you need to preserve to supplement the grain? The youngest, strongest animals were kept alive to breed in spring. The old, the weak, and the excess were slaughtered in a process that took days or weeks depending on the size of the herd. Nothing was wasted. The meat was cut into strips for drying or chunks for salting. The blood was caught in barrels for making blood puddings and sausages. The bones were saved for soup stock. The intestines became sausage casings. The hides became clothing, rope, or trade goods. Even the hooves and horns had uses. Sheep were particularly important. A sheep's thick wool provided clothing and blankets, essential for surviving the cold. Their meat preserved well. Their milk could be made into cheese and skyr, that thick fermented milk product that kept for months. And they could, in a pinch, survive the winter on not much more than hay and whatever scraps the household could spare. At settlements like Jorvik, archaeologists have found evidence that sheep outnumbered cattle significantly, probably for exactly these reasons. Cattle were more valuable alive than dead in most circumstances. A cow produced milk throughout much of the year, and that milk became butter, cheese, and skyr, all storable forms of nutrition. But keeping a cow alive through winter required substantial hay stores. Norse farmers spent much of the summer cutting and drying hay, creating massive haystacks that needed to last 5 to 6 months. Run out of hay in February, and your cow died. Your cow died, and you lost not just the meat but all the dairy products you were counting on. Pigs were perhaps the most pragmatic animals. They could eat almost anything, including food scraps and waste products humans couldn't consume. They fattened quickly, and their meat, when properly salted or smoked, could last for months. A good breeding sow was worth her weight in silver because she could produce 2 litters a year of piglets that converted garbage into protein. Then there was fishing, the lifeblood of coastal Norse communities. From August through October, the seas off Scandinavia teemed with fish, cod, herring, mackerel, and more. This wasn't sport fishing. This was industrial-scale harvesting. Entire communities mobilized for the autumn fishing season, bringing in catches that would be immediately processed for preservation. Cod, in particular, became central to Norse survival. The fish could be caught in enormous numbers in the autumn, and their lean flesh dried beautifully in the cold northern air. Stockfish, whole cod split and hung on racks to air dry, became so valuable it was used as currency. A well-prepared stockfish was hard as wood and could last for years without spoiling. It was also about as appetizing as chewing on a boot, but that was a problem for winter. Herring came in vast shoals, and the Norse developed sophisticated techniques for catching and preserving them. Barrel after barrel of herring would be salted down, each layer of fish covered with coarse salt, then sealed with wooden lids. A good herring barrel could feed a family for weeks, though you'd probably grow to hate herring with a passion that bordered on violence. But preservation wasn't just about quantity. It was about method, and this is where things get interesting and dangerous. The Norse knew that food could be preserved in several ways: drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting. Each method had advantages and risks. Each required skill, judgment, and a bit of luck. And each could, if done wrong, result in food that made you violently ill or even killed you. Drying worked beautifully in the cold, dry air of autumn. Meat and fish hung on outdoor racks would slowly desiccate, losing moisture until bacteria couldn't grow. The result was food that weighed a fraction of its original amount and could last indefinitely. The problem? If the weather turned warm or humid mid-process, the food rotted instead of drying. If you misjudged and brought it inside too early, moisture could rehydrate it just enough for mold to grow. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age sites shows occasional food waste pits filled with rotted fish, grim testimony to preservation failures. Smoking combined drying with the antibacterial properties of wood smoke. Smokehouse structures have been found at numerous Norse settlements, typically small buildings with racks inside and a fire pit below. The meat or fish would hang in the smoke for days or even weeks, slowly absorbing compounds that inhibited bacterial growth. The end product was shelf-stable but also saturated with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the same compounds that make modern smoked foods a consume in moderation recommendation. The Norse didn't consume in moderation. They consumed to survive. Salting was perhaps the most reliable preservation method, but salt was expensive. It had to be harvested from seawater through evaporation or imported from regions with natural salt deposits. A household's access to salt often determined how well they'd eat in winter. Those with ample salt could preserve meat and fish that remained relatively edible. Those without resorted to other methods with less reliable results. The process was straightforward but required precision. The meat or fish was rubbed liberally with salt, then packed in barrels with more salt between layers. The salt drew moisture out of the flesh, creating a brine that further inhibited bacterial growth. Properly salted meat could last for years, though it required soaking in fresh water before cooking to remove enough salt to make it edible. But here's where danger crept in. Undersalt your food, and bacteria survived to produce toxins. Oversalt it, and you risked salt poisoning when you ate it in quantity. The Norse had to learn these tolerances through trial and error, and the error sometimes killed people. Fermentation was the most mysterious and dangerous preservation method. The Norse understood, through generations of observation, that certain foods could be deliberately rotted in controlled ways that made them safe to eat and shelf-stable. They didn't understand the biochemistry, the competition between beneficial bacteria and harmful pathogens, the pH changes that made environments hostile to dangerous microbes, but they knew it worked. Usually, fermented fish, fermented milk, fermented meat, all were staples of the Norse winter diet. All relied on carefully maintaining conditions that favored helpful bacteria over harmful ones. Temperature too warm, and dangerous bacteria multiplied. Too cold, and nothing fermented at all. The margin for error was slim, and the consequences of failure could be fatal. The scale of autumn preparation was staggering. A typical Norse household might preserve hundreds of pounds of fish, dozens of pounds of meat, tens of gallons of milk as cheese or skyr, and bushels of grain. All of this had to be processed, packed, and stored before the cold became too severe to work outdoors. The labor was exhausting and unending. Children helped dry fish. Women churned butter and made cheese. Men slaughtered animals and smoked meat. Elder family members checked and rechecked the storage areas, looking for signs of moisture, pests, or spoilage. The sagas occasionally reference the chaos of harvest season. In the Erbygja saga, a dispute over land rights is postponed until after autumn work is complete because no one, not even feuding neighbors, had time for anything but food preparation. The Gragas, medieval Icelandic law code, contains specific provisions about what happens if someone steals food during the preservation season. The penalties were severe because such theft literally threatened survival. And then, as October faded into November, the work stopped. Not because it was done, but because it had to be done. The weather no longer permitted outdoor work. The animals that could be sheltered were brought inside the barns, crammed together for warmth. The preserved food was inventoried one final time, and every household made its grim calculations. Would it be enough? Would they see spring? Some families discovered they'd miscalculated. Perhaps the summer had been poor, and the harvest was smaller than expected. Perhaps preservation had gone wrong, and barrels of fish had spoiled. Perhaps there were more mouths to feed than anticipated, a child born, a relative taken in, an unexpected guest who'd arrived and now couldn't leave until the spring thaw. When those calculations came up short, choices had to be made. Choices about rationing. Choices about who got the best food and who got the scraps. Choices about whether to slaughter a breeding animal now for meat or keep it alive and gamble on surviving until spring. These weren't easy choices, and the sagas suggest they sometimes tore families apart. But for those who'd prepared well, who'd worked themselves to exhaustion through September and October, who'd filled their storage pits and smokehouses and barrels with enough food to last, for them, the coming of winter brought not terror, but a kind of grim satisfaction. They'd done what they could. They'd placed their bets. Now came the long wait to see if they'd survive to collect their winnings. The last boats were pulled up onto shore and turned over to protect them from snow. The last fishing nets were mended and stored. The last slaughter was completed, the last barrel sealed, the last sack of grain moved into the underground stores. And then the snow began to fall in earnest, and the darkness came, and the long test of survival began. What they'd eat in the months ahead would determine whether they lived or died. And much of what they'd eat would be food that, by modern standards, should have killed them anyway. When you walk into a Viking smokehouse in October, the smell hits you like a physical force. It's wood smoke, yes, but underneath that is fish, hundreds of pounds of split cod, herring, and mackerel hanging from wooden rafters. The flesh glistens with moisture that's slowly being pulled out by smoke and air. The fish haven't rotted, not yet, but they're on the edge. Everything about Norse food preservation exists on that knife's edge between safe and deadly. The Vikings didn't understand microbiology. They couldn't have explained why some methods worked and others failed. But through generations of trial, error, and occasional death, they developed sophisticated techniques for keeping food edible through the long winter. What's remarkable is how many of these techniques actively courted danger, using processes that created foods we now classify as biohazards. Let's start with stockfish, perhaps the most successful Viking preservation method. The process was simple in concept. Split the fish, remove the guts and head, then hang them on outdoor racks to dry in the cold autumn air. The temperature needed to be just right, cold enough to prevent bacterial growth, but not so cold that the fish froze solid before drying. Northern Norway, with its stable cold temperatures and low humidity, became famous for producing the highest quality stockfish. The fish would hang for weeks or even months, slowly transforming from soft flesh to something resembling wood. The final product was so hard you couldn't bite into it. It had to be soaked in water for days to rehydrate or beaten with a hammer to break it into edible pieces. One saga describes warriors using stockfish as improvised weapons when caught without swords, and this isn't as absurd as it sounds. A properly dried stockfish could genuinely be used as a club, but dried stockfish was safe food. It couldn't support bacterial growth at such low moisture levels. The real danger came with the fermented products, and here we need to talk about hakarl, perhaps the most infamous Norse food still eaten in Iceland today. Hakarl is fermented shark, specifically Greenland shark, and making it is a process that requires either tremendous courage or reckless disregard for human life. The Greenland shark is poisonous when fresh. Its flesh contains high levels of trimethylamine oxide and urea, compounds that break down into trimethylamine and ammonia. Eat fresh Greenland shark, and you'll experience effects similar to being extremely drunk, followed by unpleasant illness. Eat enough, and the ammonia can damage your kidneys. The Norse solution was to bury the shark. They'd dig a pit in gravelly soil, place the shark meat inside, cover it with gravel and sand, then weight it down with stones. Over the next 6 to 12 weeks, the meat would ferment. The trimethylamine oxide converted to trimethylamine, which then evaporated or drained away in the fluids that seeped from the meat. The urea broke down into ammonia, which also largely dissipated. The result was meat that reeked of ammonia strong enough to make your eyes water, but was technically safe to eat. Technically, the problem was quality control. Dig up your shark too early, and enough toxins remained to make you seriously ill. Leave it too long, and actual rot set in. The Norse had to judge by smell and appearance whether the fermentation had progressed correctly, a skill passed down through generations, but never foolproof. Modern visitors to Iceland often try hakarl as a dare. The smell alone causes many to refuse. Those brave enough to taste it describe flavors ranging from intense ammonia to something that died and came back wrong. And yet, for the Norse, particularly in Iceland where other protein sources were limited, hakarl represented valuable food that would keep through winter without further preservation. Lutefisk, still eaten in Scandinavia today, represents another gamble with chemistry. The process starts with dried stockfish, which is then soaked in water mixed with lye. Yes, the same caustic substance used to make soap. The lye breaks down the fish proteins, turning the rock-hard stockfish into a gelatinous, translucent mass with the consistency of jelly. The fish is then soaked in multiple changes of fresh water to remove the lye, which if not done thoroughly enough, will burn your mouth and throat. Why would anyone do this? The lye treatment made stockfish edible again without fire, valuable when fuel was scarce. It also, paradoxically, made the fish easier to digest for people whose stomachs were adapted to the Norse diet. The end product, while off-putting to modern tastes, was protein-rich food that had been preserved twice, once by drying, once by chemical treatment. But even lutefisk's dangerousness pales compared to some of the meat preservation methods. Blood sausages, common across Viking territories, combine blood caught during slaughter with fat, oats, and seasonings, then stuffed into cleaned intestines and either cooked or left to ferment slightly. These sausages walked a fine line. The blood could harbor pathogens if the animal had been diseased. The fermentation could go wrong if temperatures weren't right. And yet, blood sausages provided essential iron and protein in a compact, relatively stable form. Salt-cured meat presented different risks. The process required covering meat with salt, then packing it in barrels with more salt. The meat released moisture, which mixed with the salt to create brine. This brine needed to remain saturated with salt, dilute it with too much meat juice, and bacteria could survive. Archaeological evidence shows that Norse barrels were often topped up with additional brine to maintain concentration. But here's what the Norse couldn't know. Certain bacteria, particularly Clostridium botulinum, can survive in low-oxygen environments like sealed barrels. If the salt concentration dropped or if the seal was imperfect, botulism became a real risk. Botulism poisoning causes paralysis and death, and there's no treatment without modern medicine. The Norse must have occasionally experienced this, though they wouldn't have understood what killed them, just that sometimes the preserved meat killed instead of nourished. Smoking meat created its own hazards. The process required maintaining a fire that produced heavy smoke but not too much heat, which would cook rather than preserve the meat. The meat hung in this smoke for days, absorbing compounds that inhibited bacterial growth. But those same compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and formaldehyde, are carcinogens. A diet heavy in smoked foods, which the Norse winter diet certainly was, increased cancer risk significantly. We have no reliable statistics on cancer rates in Viking Age Scandinavia, but skeletal remains show that those who survived childhood and the dangers of daily life often lived into their 50s or 60s. Whether they experienced higher rates of cancer from their diet is unknown, but biochemically, they almost certainly did. They just died of other things first: infections, injuries, complications from childbirth, before cancer had time to develop. Fermented milk products represented a safer category of preservation, but even these required skill. The Norse made skyr, a thick fermented milk product similar to yogurt, but with the consistency of soft cheese. The process required heating milk, adding a culture from a previous batch, then letting it ferment at the right temperature. Too warm, and harmful bacteria multiplied. Too cold, and it didn't ferment at all. Skyr could keep for months in cold storage, providing valuable protein and calcium. But batches sometimes failed, producing something that was actively dangerous rather than merely sour. The Norse probably learned to identify failed fermentation by smell and appearance, but mistakes happened. A child eating a spoonful of skyr from a bad batch might suffer nothing more than an upset stomach or might develop serious illness. Cheesemaking faced similar challenges. The Norse made simple cheeses by adding rennet to milk, allowing curds to form, then pressing out the whey and aging the cheese. Aged cheese could last for months, even years. But the aging process required careful monitoring. Mold could grow, some beneficial, some deadly. The blue-green molds that give some cheeses their flavor were probably discovered by accident and adopted because they didn't kill people. Other molds did. Perhaps most dangerous were the preserved eggs. The Norse kept chickens for eggs as well as meat, but chickens lay fewer eggs in winter. Autumn eggs needed to be preserved for winter use. One method involved coating eggs in fat, tallow, or butter, then storing them in barrels of grain or sand. This reduced oxygen exposure and slowed spoilage. But eggs are particularly prone to harboring salmonella bacteria, and the Norse preservation methods didn't always prevent contamination. Eating a preserved egg that had gone bad could cause severe food poisoning, fever, vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration. In winter, when the body was already stressed from cold and limited diet, such illness could be fatal, especially for children or the elderly. The Norse probably learned to test eggs by floating them in water. Fresh eggs sink, rotten ones float due to gas buildup from bacterial activity. But this test isn't foolproof. Vegetables pose their own preservation challenges. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions could be stored in cold, dark root cellars where they'd keep for months. But the cellars had to be cold enough to prevent sprouting and rot, yet not so cold that the vegetables froze and turned to mush. Maintaining this balance through winter required constant attention. Cabbage could be fermented into something like sauerkraut, a process that produces beneficial acids that prevent the growth of harmful bacteria. The Norse probably made fermented cabbage, though direct evidence is limited. What we know is that fermented vegetables appear in many cold climate cultures as a preservation strategy, and the Norse would have been foolish not to use it. They also dried certain plants, peas, beans, herbs for seasoning and medicine. Dried legumes were reasonably safe if kept dry, though they could harbor weevils and other insects. Eating weevil-infested peas won't kill you, but it's unpleasant and reduces the nutritional value of the food. The underlying theme of all Norse preservation methods was risk management. Every technique carried dangers, but starvation was a certainty if they didn't preserve food. So they developed methods, passed down through oral tradition and hard experience, for maximizing the chances that their preserved food would sustain rather than kill them. They learned to trust their noses and eyes, smell the meat, look for discoloration, check the brine level, inspect for mold. They developed rules about what was safe. Don't eat fish that smells sweet, a sign of certain bacterial contamination. Don't eat meat from an animal that died sick, might harbor pathogens. Don't trust preserved food that's been in warm storage. Bacterial growth accelerates with heat. But these rules weren't foolproof, and the consequences of mistakes ranged from mild illness to death. The sagas occasionally mention people dying after feasts, deaths sometimes attributed to poisoning by enemies, but probably often caused by food poisoning from poorly preserved foods. The Brynjolfur saga describes several feast scenes where people become ill afterward, a detail that probably reflects genuine experience with food contamination. Archaeological evidence supports the danger. Excavations of Viking-age latrines show remains of parasitic worms, tapeworms, roundworms, whipworms, that came from consuming undercooked or contaminated meat. These parasites caused chronic illness, malnutrition, and sometimes death. A person with a heavy tapeworm infestation could eat regularly and still slowly starve as the parasites consume nutrients. The Norse also faced mercury poisoning from eating fish and sea mammals. Greenland sharks, in particular, accumulate mercury in their tissues. While the fermentation process for Hakarl reduced some toxins, it didn't remove mercury. A diet heavy in shark, seal, or whale meat would slowly build up mercury levels in the body, causing neurological problems, kidney damage, and other health issues. We can't know how many Norse people died or suffered chronic illness from their diet, but the number was certainly significant. What's remarkable is that they survived at all, that they developed preservation methods that worked well enough, often enough, to sustain a culture through centuries of harsh winters. Their techniques were sophisticated for their time, based on careful observation and accumulated knowledge. But they were also fundamentally dangerous, especially by modern standards. Every barrel of preserved meat, every hanging stockfish, every batch of fermented shark represented a calculated risk. Usually, people survived. Sometimes, they didn't. And every winter, as families opened their stores and began eating what they'd preserved months earlier, they must have wondered, will this be the batch that kills us? Will this be the winter the preservation went wrong? It was Russian roulette with food, played out in longhouses across Scandinavia, with survival as the only prize worth playing for. Imagine standing in a Norse storage room in November, right after the first heavy snows have sealed you inside for winter. The room is cut into the hillside behind the longhouse, its walls lined with stone to keep it cool, but not freezing. Your eyes adjust to the dim light from the doorway, and you begin to count. 3 barrels of salted herring, 2 barrels of salted mutton, 1 barrel of salted pork, maybe half full, 8 hanging sides of smoked lamb, 20 dried cod stacked like cordwood, 6 wheels of hard cheese, 2 large tubs of skyr, 3 sacks of barley grain, 1 small sack of oats, a basket of dried peas, another of dried beans, turnips and carrots packed in sand, onions hanging in nets, a half barrel of butter, a smaller barrel of honey, if you were very fortunate, and in the corner, the precious reserves, a small amount of salt, some dried herbs, a few precious spices if someone had been trading. This is your wealth. This is your life. This collection of preserved food will determine whether you see spring or whether your family joins the grim statistics of yet another harsh winter. And now comes the terrible arithmetic that every Norse householder had to master. How much food do you have? How many mouths must be fed? And how long must it last? Let's work through the mathematics. A typical Norse household might contain 6 to 10 people, parents, children, perhaps an elderly grandparent or a widowed sibling. Each person needed roughly 2,000 calories per day to maintain body weight and function, though in the cold of winter, when bodies worked harder to stay warm, the requirement was probably higher, perhaps 2,500 or even 3,000 calories for adults doing physical work. Multiply those numbers out, and a household of 8 people needed 16,000 to 20,000 calories per day, or roughly 450,000 to 600,000 calories per month. Winter lasted 5 to 6 months, so you needed between 2.25 and 3.6 million calories stored to feed everyone through to spring. These are staggering numbers, and remember, this is just calories, not accounting for nutritional balance, vitamins, or minerals. A barrel of salted herring might contain 50 to 60 fish, depending on size. Each fish provided perhaps 800 to 1,000 calories, so a full barrel held roughly 50,000 calories. 3 barrels of herring, then, gave you 150,000 calories, enough to feed your household for maybe a week, or to stretch as a supplement over several weeks. Salt meat was more calorie-dense because of its fat content. A barrel of salted pork might hold 40 to 50 pounds of meat and fat combined. Pork fat is roughly 4,000 calories per pound, and the meat itself adds more, so a full barrel could provide 200,000 or more calories. But you only had one barrel, and it was half full. The dried cod, stockfish, was your backup, your insurance policy. Each fish, when rehydrated and cooked, might provide 600 to 800 calories. 20 fish gave you perhaps 14,000 calories, a few days' worth for the household, or a critical supplement to stretch other foods further. The grain was your foundation. Barley and oats were calorie-dense and relatively stable. A pound of grain provided roughly 1,600 calories when cooked into porridge or baked into bread. 3 sacks of barley, if each held 50 pounds, gave you 240,000 calories. The oats added another 80,000. This was substantial, but it was also your baseline. The food that would keep you from outright starvation even if everything else ran out. Cheese and skyr provided protein and fat. Hard cheese was extremely calorie-dense, roughly 1,600 calories per pound. 6 wheels, if each weighed 8 pounds, gave you nearly 77,000 calories. Skyr was less dense, maybe 600 calories per pound, but the 2 tubs might hold 20 pounds between them, 12,000 more calories. Add it all up, and you're looking at perhaps 800,000 to 900,000 calories total in storage. For a household of 8 people needing 2.5 million calories to make it through 5 months of winter, this is catastrophically short. You have maybe 1/3 of what you need. This is where the real survival strategy began. You couldn't eat normally and expect to last. You had to ration, had to stretch, had to supplement with anything else you could find. And you had to do it in a way that kept everyone healthy enough to work and survive, because a sick or weakened person became a liability that endangered everyone. The Norse developed several strategies. First was differential rationing. Working-age adults who had to perform physical tasks, feeding animals, hauling firewood, repairing the longhouse, got larger portions. Children got enough to grow, but not luxuriously. The elderly and infirm received less. A cruel calculation, but a necessary one. In the bleakest winters, the very old sometimes voluntarily ate less, sacrificing themselves so younger family members might survive. The sagas hint at this without stating it explicitly. In Grettir's saga, an old man tells his family to save the food for those who will see summer, and shortly after takes to his bed and dies. The implication is clear. He stopped eating, freeing up resources. Whether this was common or rare, we can't know, but it appears in enough sources to suggest it happened. Second was meal frequency. Instead of 3 meals a day, winter might mean 2, or even 1 substantial meal plus small snacks. You ate your main meal in the middle of the day when you were most active and needed energy. Evening might bring just a piece of bread and some dried fish. This reduced overall consumption without leaving anyone completely starving. Third was food supplementation through anything edible you could find or hunt. This is where winter Vikings became remarkably creative and, from a modern perspective, reckless. Small game could be trapped even in winter. Rabbits, hares, and birds didn't disappear just because snow fell. Snares and traps set near the longhouse might catch something. A single rabbit provided perhaps 500 to 600 calories. Not much, but every bit helped. Archaeological sites show abundant small animal bones in winter layers of refuse heaps, suggesting this was common. Fishing through ice, where possible, provided supplemental protein. The Norse cut holes in frozen lakes and dropped baited lines through. Ice fishing is cold, tedious work with uncertain results, but even a few fish per week meant a few hundred extra calories. Coastal communities continued fishing in the fjords whenever weather permitted, though this was dangerous work in winter storms. Seabirds and their eggs were another source. Even in winter, seabirds roost on cliffs. The Norse would scale these cliffs, a terrifying prospect in icy conditions, to collect eggs or catch birds with nets. This was skilled, dangerous work typically done by young men who were both brave and desperate. Falls from cliffs were not uncommon, but the alternative was watching your family slowly starve. Seaweed and kelp supplemented the diet in coastal areas. These weren't calorie-rich, but they provided minerals and vitamins otherwise lacking in the winter diet. They could be dried, stored, and added to soups or porridges. Archaeological evidence shows the Norse collected various seaweeds, and their utility in preventing scurvy, a constant threat on a diet of preserved meat and grain, was probably understood intuitively even if not scientifically. Marine mammals, seals, occasionally small whales, were hunted when spotted. A seal provided substantial meat and blubber, the latter being extremely calorie-dense. Seal blubber was sometimes rendered into oil for lamp fuel, but in desperate times, it was food. A pound of seal fat contained roughly 4,000 calories. Even a small seal might provide 20 to 30 pounds of fat, a bonanza of 80,000 to 120,000 calories that could feed a family for weeks. But seal hunting in winter was perilous. The animals were hunted from boats in rough seas or by waiting at breathing holes in the ice, both dangerous propositions. The sagas mention men lost to winter seal hunting, swept overboard, or falling through ice. Still, the reward was worth the risk when the alternative was starvation. The longhouse itself hosted additional food sources. Rats and mice that infested storage areas were killed and sometimes eaten in desperation. Leather clothing, boots, and even harnesses could be boiled to extract what little nutrition they offered. The sagas mention people eating leather during the worst famines, a practice that sounds like myth, but was probably true. Leather is collagen, and while it's not particularly digestible, boiling it long enough produces a kind of gelatin that provides some calories and might keep someone alive a few days longer. Even tree bark could be eaten. The inner bark of certain trees, particularly pine, contains some nutrients and can be ground into flour to extend grain supplies. Bread made with bark flour was gritty, bitter, and barely digestible, but it filled stomachs and provided minimal calories. Archaeological analysis of preserved feces from Norse sites shows occasional tree bark consumption, confirming this wasn't just saga exaggeration. The livestock sheltered in the barn provided additional resources, though using them required careful calculation. Chickens continued laying eggs through winter, albeit fewer than in summer. Each egg was precious. Should you eat it now for immediate calories, or wait and hope it hatches into a chicken that lays more eggs in spring? These decisions multiplied across everything. Should you slaughter a sheep now for meat, or keep it alive for wool and potential lambs in spring? Should you use all the milk for drinking, or make some into cheese that stores longer? Blood was regularly drawn from livestock in small quantities that didn't harm the animals. A cup of blood from a cow or sheep could be mixed with oats and fat to make blood pudding, providing iron and protein without killing the animal. This practice, recorded in historical sources and still used in some traditional cultures, meant livestock served as renewable food sources through winter, not just one-time meals. The social dynamics of winter food storage created interesting pressures. In wealthier households, or among chieftains, there was an expectation of hospitality. The sagas emphasized that a mark of status was the ability to host guests and provide food generously. But in winter, every guest was another mouth draining your reserves. This created tension between the cultural obligation to be hospitable and the practical need to conserve food. Some households solved this by seasonal gift exchanges. In autumn, when you had abundance, you'd give generously to others. In winter, when they had abundance, they'd reciprocate. This spread risk. If your harvest failed but your neighbors succeeded, their generosity kept you alive, and you'd repay them in future years. The Norse called this system of mutual obligation and gift-giving the web of Wird, the interconnected fate that bound communities together. But not all households could maintain reserves. Poorer families, those who'd had a bad harvest or suffered some misfortune, might find themselves running out of food by midwinter. This is where the community structures became critical. The wealthy had obligations to the less fortunate, enforced both by social pressure and, in some cases, by law. The Icelandic law code specified that landowners must provide for those who lacked resources, though the amounts were minimal, basically enough to prevent outright starvation, not comfort. For those without community support, the options narrowed terribly. Some became itinerant beggars, traveling from farm to farm seeking charity. In winter, this was desperately dangerous. Caught in a blizzard between farms, you died. The sagas mention frozen travelers found in spring thaw, people who'd gambled on making it to the next settlement and lost. Others resorted to theft. Stealing food in winter was one of the most serious crimes in Norse society, punishable by outlawry or even execution. The severity of the punishment reflected how existential the crime was. Taking someone's winter stores didn't just harm them, it might kill them and their family. Yet desperation drove some to attempt it anyway. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses into actual winter storage practices. At the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, excavators found remains of storage containers and food preservation equipment that suggested the household had substantial reserves, multiple large barrels, specialized storage buildings, and evidence of both grain and meat storage in quantity. This was clearly a wealthy household. At more modest sites like Stong in Iceland, storage facilities were simpler but still sophisticated. Underground pits lined with stone held grain. Separate structures served as smokehouses and cold storage. The layout suggests careful planning to maximize preservation while minimizing spoilage risk. Analysis of refused deposits tells us what people actually ate through winter. The ratio of fish bones to mammal bones shifts noticeably in winter layers. More fish, less fresh meat, suggesting people relied more heavily on preserved fish and reserved precious meat for special occasions. Plant remains show heavy use of grains and legumes in winter, with green vegetables disappearing almost entirely from the diet. Human remains from Norse cemeteries show seasonal variation in health markers. Teeth examined for enamel defects show periods of nutritional stress that correspond to late winter and early spring, the starving time, when winter stores ran lowest and spring foods weren't yet available. Bone analysis shows that children in particular suffered from periodic malnutrition, with growth interruptions visible in the bone structure. Some skeletons show signs of scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, from a diet of preserved meat and grain with few fresh vegetables. Scurvy causes bleeding gums, loose teeth, poor wound healing, and eventually death. The Norse probably recognized scurvy as a winter illness without understanding its cause. Those who had access to seaweed, berries preserved in honey, or other vitamin C sources fared better. The psychological impact of winter rationing shouldn't be underestimated. Imagine knowing in November that the food in your storage room must last until April, and that there's not quite enough. Every meal becomes a calculation. Every bite carries guilt. If I eat more, someone else must eat less. Children cry from hunger. Adults grow irritable and depressed. The cold makes everything worse, as bodies burn more calories just staying warm. The Norse coped through a combination of stoicism and distraction. The long winter nights were filled with storytelling, craft work, and socializing. The sagas themselves were probably refined and passed down during these winter gatherings. Epic tales that transported listeners from their cold, hungry present to glorious pasts full of heroes and abundance. They also coped through the certain knowledge that spring would come. It always had. The cycle of seasons was reliable even when food supplies weren't. Every week survived was a week closer to thaw, to fishing resuming, to the first greens emerging, to animals giving birth and producing milk again. This psychological anchor, the certainty of eventual relief, was perhaps as important to survival as the food itself. Some years were easier than others. A mild winter meant livestock survived better, requiring less stored food. An early spring brought relief sooner. But some years were catastrophic. The sagas and historical records mention great winters, when snow piled so deep that buildings collapsed, when cold was so intense that livestock froze despite being sheltered, when spring came late and stores ran out completely. The winter of 1315 to 1316, though after the main Viking Age, is documented in European chronicles and affected Scandinavia as well. The previous summer had been cold and wet, ruining harvests across the continent. The winter that followed saw widespread famine. Chronicles mention people eating dogs, cats, and things better not mentioned. This was the reality of a preservation system failing, when the stored food simply wasn't enough and no alternatives existed. Archaeological evidence suggests some Norse settlements were simply abandoned after particularly harsh winters. Excavations find longhouses that show signs of sudden desertion, valuable items left behind. Food remains suggesting stocks were depleted, no signs of the careful decommissioning that would accompany a planned move. These were probably communities where too many people died or where survivors fled to seek help elsewhere, knowing they couldn't last another season in that location. The winter pantry, then, was more than just food storage. It was a mathematical problem, a social contract, a psychological challenge, and ultimately a matter of life and death. The Norse who mastered this challenge, who preserved enough food, who rationed wisely, who maintained community bonds, who endured the cold and hunger with grim determination, they survived to tell their stories. Those who didn't became cautionary tales, names mentioned briefly in sagas as examples of what happened when you miscalculated, when you preserved poorly, when you alienated your neighbors, or when you simply had bad luck. The winter pantry separated the survivors from the dead, and every autumn, as harvest ended and snow began, every Norse household ran those numbers again and hoped they'd counted correctly. Wake in darkness. That's how every winter morning begins in a Norse longhouse. The fire has burned down to coals, and the cold has crept back into the room despite the bodies huddled together for warmth. Your breath makes clouds in the icy air. Somewhere, a child is crying. Hungry already, though the day has barely begun. You're hungry too. You've been hungry since November, a constant gnawing presence in your belly that never quite goes away. But you don't eat yet. The first meal won't come until midday, and you have work to do before then. You need to conserve calories, stretch the food as far as possible, and eating in the morning would be wasteful. First, the fire must be rebuilt. You add precious firewood to the coals, blow gently until flames catch, then add more wood. Each piece of wood represents labor. Someone cut it, hauled it, stacked it, and represents warmth you'll need again tonight. You can't be generous with fire any more than you can be generous with food. Once there's enough light to see, the daily routine begins. The animals must be fed and watered. In winter, livestock live in the barn attached to the longhouse, and their presence helps heat the structure. But they need hay, and water must be brought from the stream or melted from snow. Arduous work when everything is frozen. The chickens, if they're still laying, might provide an egg or two. These are treasures to be carefully considered. Do you eat them now for immediate nutrition, or save them for a day when there's nothing else? The decision weighs on you. By midday, with the weak winter sun at its highest, it's time for the main meal. This is what Norse winter eating actually looked like. Not the feast hall scenes of mead and roasted meat, but the grinding reality of subsistence on preserved food. The basic meal was porridge, made from barley or oats cooked in water, or, if you were fortunate, milk. The grain was measured carefully, enough to fill stomachs, but not so much that you'd run out before spring. A typical portion might be a cup of raw grain per adult, which would swell to 3 or 4 cups when cooked. Children got less. The elderly, if food was short, might get less still. The porridge bubbled in an iron cauldron suspended over the fire. It was thick, gluey, and almost tasteless. The Norse added salt if they had it, and herbs if any remained from autumn, dried thyme, perhaps, or fennel. But mostly it was just grain and water, boiled until edible. To this basic porridge, you'd add whatever else you had. A piece of dried fish, soaked until it was soft enough to chew, might be broken up and stirred in. The fish added protein and some fat, making the meal more sustaining. Stockfish had to be soaked for days before use, so you had to plan ahead. Today's meal required thinking ahead last week. Or you might add a small piece of salted meat. Just a few ounces per person, carefully rationed from the barrel. The meat was so salty it had to be soaked in water first, changing the water several times to draw out enough salt to make it palatable. Even then, the saltiness was intense, making you thirsty. But thirsty was better than hungry, and the meat provided essential calories. Blood pudding or blood sausage might supplement the porridge. These were made from animal blood collected during slaughter, mixed with fat and oats, then either cooked or fermented. Blood is rich in iron and protein, and nothing was wasted. A thick slice of blood sausage floating in your porridge wasn't appetizing by modern standards, but it kept you alive. Cheese was another supplement. Hard cheese, aged through autumn, could be grated or sliced thin and added to porridge or eaten with hard flatbread. The cheese was strong, pungent, and extremely salty. More salt for preservation, but it provided protein, fat, and calcium. A small piece went a long way toward making the meal feel more substantial. Skyr, that thick fermented milk product, might be served alongside the porridge. It was sour, thick enough to cut with a knife, and filling. Mixed with a tiny amount of honey if any remained, or with dried berries, it became almost pleasant. Unmixed, it was an acquired taste that you acquired through necessity. The bread was flatbread, hard and dark. Norse flatbread wasn't leavened. No yeast, just barley flour mixed with water, perhaps with a bit of fat added, rolled thin and baked on hot stones or iron griddles. It kept forever if stored properly, becoming harder and harder until you had to soak it in liquid to make it chewable. But it was portable, stable, and made the grain stores stretch further than porridge alone. Sometimes the flatbread contained additions, dried peas or beans ground into the flour, or even bark flour if grain was running short. Tree bark made the bread grittier and darker and harder to digest, but it filled stomachs and added bulk to limited grain supplies. The meal was eaten from wooden bowls with wooden spoons. Everyone gathered around the fire, sitting on benches or the sleeping platforms that lined the walls. The meal was a social time, one of the few breaks in the day's work. People talked, shared news, told stories. But the portions were always carefully controlled. The person serving the porridge, usually the household's senior woman, ladled out precise amounts. There were no seconds. What you got was what you got. After the meal, there might be a small piece of dried fruit if any remained from autumn, a fig or date if someone had been trading, or dried apples or berries. These were special treats, rationed carefully. A child might get a single dried berry to suck on, making it last as long as possible. The sweetness was a revelation after the bland, salty meal. Then came the afternoon stretch of work. The meal provided energy for a few hours of activity, but by evening, hunger returned. The evening meal, if there was one, was smaller still, perhaps just a piece of flatbread with a scraping of butter or a leftover bit of fish. Some households made do with a drink of buttermilk or whey left over from cheesemaking. The liquid rations deserve special mention. Water was readily available, melted from snow or drawn from streams, but the Norse drank far more than water. Small beer, weak ale brewed from barley, was a staple. The brewing process made the water safer to drink, and the beer provided additional calories. It wasn't meant to intoxicate. The alcohol content was low, but to nourish. Whey, the liquid byproduct of cheesemaking, was often consumed as well. It was thin, slightly sour, but it contained protein and other nutrients. Nothing was wasted. Even the water used to soak salt meat or dried fish might be reused in soup, carrying whatever nutrients and flavor it had absorbed. The monotony of this diet cannot be overstated. Day after day, week after week, month after month, porridge with fish, porridge with meat, flatbread, cheese, skyr, watery soup, more porridge. The same flavors, salt, smoke, fermented sourness, repeated endlessly. No fresh vegetables, no fresh fruit, no variety beyond swapping, which preserved protein you added to your grain. This monotony had psychological effects. People craved variety desperately. A saga mentions a chieftain breaking into his winter stores early just to have honey because he could not bear another day of sameness. The text presents this as weakness, but it reveals how oppressive the unchanging diet became. The lack of vitamin C was particularly problematic. Scurvy starts to manifest after about 3 months without vitamin C. By late winter, many Norse people probably showed early signs: fatigue, irritability, bleeding gums, small bruises. Those with access to preserved berries or certain herbs fared better, but scurvy was likely a common late winter ailment. The high-salt diet caused its own problems. Excessive salt consumption leads to thirst, increased urination, and can cause stomach problems. Over time, it contributes to high blood pressure and kidney damage. The Norse diet, heavy with salted fish and meat, certainly exceeded what we'd now consider safe salt levels. But the alternative was food that spoiled and killed you faster than salt ever would. The lack of dietary fiber from fresh vegetables probably caused chronic constipation and digestive discomfort. The diet was heavy in meat and grain but light in the plant materials that keep digestive systems functioning well. Dried peas and beans helped, but they were often in short supply. Archaeological analysis of coprolites, preserved feces, from Norse sites shows this was indeed a problem. The overall caloric insufficiency took its toll as well. Even with careful eating, most Norse people operated at a caloric deficit through winter. Bodies adapted by lowering metabolism, reducing energy expenditure. People moved more slowly, felt tired constantly, and struggled to stay warm. Weight loss was universal. Everyone emerged from winter thinner than they'd entered it. Children suffered particularly. Growing bodies need adequate nutrition, and winter offered the opposite. Archaeological studies of Norse children's skeletons show growth interruptions corresponding to winters, periods when bones grew more slowly or not at all due to malnutrition. Children who survived multiple Norse winters bore permanent markers of those privations in their very bones. Yet people found small joys in the meals. The warmth of hot porridge on a freezing morning. The satisfaction of a full belly, however briefly. The taste of a precious bit of honey or the tiny luxury of butter on bread. These small pleasures took on outsized importance when so little else provided comfort. Meals were also social anchors. The midday meal brought the household together. Stories were told. Plans were made. Complaints were aired. In the long darkness of winter, these gatherings provided structure to otherwise formless days. The meal might be monotonous, but the companionship mattered as much as the food. Special occasions broke the monotony slightly. Midwinter celebrations meant slightly larger portions or a taste of something held in reserve. A birth or marriage, even in winter, might justify opening a special barrel or using preserved foods more generously. These splurges were carefully calculated. You couldn't feast often, but never celebrating made winter psychologically unbearable. The Norse also supplemented their diet with hot drinks beyond beer and whey. Herbal teas made from whatever dried plants remained provided warmth and variety. Some herbs had medicinal properties, chamomile for calming, mint for digestion. These drinks offered a break from the monotony without consuming precious food calories. Soup-making stretched resources further. Water, bones, a bit of meat or fish, some barley or peas, whatever vegetables remained, all simmered together for hours, creating a thin broth that could be eaten over several days. Each day more water was added, along with any new scraps, and the pot bubbled continuously. Some sources suggest Norse households maintained a perpetual stew that lasted all winter, never emptying completely, just continuously added to. This practice, if true, carried risks. A pot that never fully cleans out can harbor bacteria and layers of old food stuck to its bottom. But it also meant no edible scrap was wasted, and there was always something hot available. The continuous heating probably killed most pathogens, though not all. The actual cooking methods were simple, but required skill. The iron cauldron suspended over the fire needed constant attention to prevent burning. Food could be placed directly on coals, flatbread, for instance, or fish wrapped in wet seaweed. Stone slabs heated by the fire served as griddles. The Norse didn't have ovens in the modern sense, just open fires and the ingenuity to use them effectively. Smoke was omnipresent. The longhouse had a central hearth, but no proper chimney, just a hole in the roof that let some smoke out. Everything you ate carried a slight taste of smoke. Your clothes reeked of it. Your hair absorbed it. Smoke became your constant companion, and you learned to ignore the sting in your eyes and the tickle in your throat. The daily routine of eating was thus inseparable from the daily routine of survival. Wake, work, eat at midday, work more, eat minimally at evening, sleep, repeat. The food provided just enough calories to continue the cycle. You weren't thriving, you were enduring. And endurance was the highest achievement winter offered. Some days were worse than others. Days when the portions were especially small because stores were running low. Days when the water froze and had to be melted before cooking could begin. Days when the fire wouldn't start properly and the porridge burned. Days when children cried because they were still hungry after the meal. Days when adults snapped at each other from hunger-induced irritability. But some days were better. Days when someone caught a rabbit in a snare and there was fresh meat, however small the portion. Days when a chicken laid an unexpected egg. Days when someone found a forgotten cache of hazelnuts in a corner of the storage room. These small victories kept spirits from breaking entirely. The Norse understood that survival wasn't just physical, it was mental. They structured winter life to maintain morale despite privation. The meals, as monotonous as they were, provided routine. The household chores gave purpose. The evening socializing around the dying fire gave community. And the knowledge that every day survived was a day closer to spring gave hope. That hope was essential because the alternative, giving up, accepting death, was always present. Some people did give up, especially the elderly or those already weakened by illness. They stopped eating, turned their faces to the wall, and slipped away quietly. Whether this was voluntary euthanasia to spare family resources or simple exhaustion with the struggle, we can't always know. But it happened, and the sagas mention it matter-of-factly, suggesting it was understood if not openly discussed. For those who kept going, the daily meals were small victories. Each bowl of porridge was proof you'd lasted another day. Each piece of flatbread was evidence that the preservation had worked, that the stores hadn't spoiled, that you'd planned adequately. The food might have been monotonous, but it was there, and that was triumph enough. As winter wore on and February became March, the meals grew smaller. The stores were diminishing, and everyone knew the last weeks before spring thaw were always the hardest. This was when rationing became most severe, when every scrap mattered, when people began eyeing the seed grain, reserved for spring planting, and wondering if they should eat it now and gamble on surviving to trade for more seed later. Eating the seed grain was a last resort, a sign that things had gone terribly wrong. Do that, and even if you survived winter, you couldn't plant in spring, which meant next winter would be even worse. But people did it sometimes, when the choice was between possible future starvation and certain present starvation. The sagas mention this as one of the marks of a catastrophic winter, and they ate their seed corn and knew not what they would do in spring. But most years, most people made it through. The stores ran low, but not out. The hunger was constant, but not fatal. And then, finally, the days began to lengthen. The sun climbed higher. The snow started melting. And people knew they'd survived another winter, however barely. The first fresh food of spring, whether a fish caught in newly opened water, or the first green shoots of plants emerging from the ground, or eggs from chickens that began laying more frequently. These tasted like salvation. After months of preserved, smoked, salted, and fermented monotony, something fresh was almost overwhelming. The Norse word for this period, gore, translates roughly as last provisions or the dregs. It was the time when you ate whatever remained, no matter how unappealing. The word carries connotations of both hardship and pride. Yes, you were down to the dregs, but you'd made it far enough to have dregs left at all. The daily winter meals of the Norse were a masterclass in making do, in stretching limited resources, in finding satisfaction in subsistence. They weren't eating for pleasure, they were eating to survive. And survive they did, generation after generation, through countless winters, sustained by porridge and dried fish and the grim determination that characterized their entire culture. Every bowl of bland porridge, every piece of rock-hard flatbread, every bite of overly salted meat was a small victory against the dark and cold. Together, these meals added up to survival. And survival, in the end, was all that mattered. Let's talk about Hakarl. Not metaphorically, not theoretically, but viscerally. Imagine taking a cube of shark meat that's been buried in gravelly soil for 3 months, then hung to dry for another 4. The result looks like hard, whitish chunks of fish, but the smell hits you like a physical blow. Ammonia so strong your eyes water immediately, mixed with something fishy and faintly rotten. This is what Icelandic Vikings ate through winter, and this is what could legitimately poison you if prepared incorrectly. The Greenland shark is one of the world's most toxic fish when fresh. Its flesh contains high concentrations of trimethylamine oxide and urea. Eat it fresh, and you'll experience effects similar to extreme intoxication, disorientation, nausea, difficulty breathing. Continued consumption causes neurological damage. The Greenland shark's flesh is poisonous because the animal has no urinary tract. It instead concentrates urea and toxic compounds in its muscles to maintain osmotic balance in Arctic waters. The Norse solution was fermentation, but this was fermentation as a tightrope walk between deadly toxin and edible food. The process required burying shark meat in shallow pits, usually in coarse gravel or sand. The weight of stones placed on top pressed fluids out of the meat, fluids containing much of the toxic compounds. Over 6 to 12 weeks, depending on temperature, the urea broke down into ammonia, which slowly dissipated. But here's the lethal gamble. Dig up your shark too early, and enough toxins remain to cause serious illness or death. Leave it too long without proper drainage, and true rot set in, producing entirely different toxins from bacterial decomposition. The Norse had to judge readiness by smell, appearance, and texture. skills passed down through generations, but never foolproof. Modern chemical analysis of properly prepared Hakarl shows it still contains concerning levels of ammonia and other compounds. It's technically safe. Hundreds of years of Icelandic consumption prove that. But safe, on a spectrum. Eat too much, and you'll experience ammonia toxicity. Children, the elderly, or anyone with compromised kidney function faced higher risks. The historical record shows this wasn't academic. The Landnámabók mentions several deaths attributed to bad winter food. And while we can't know specifics, contaminated fermented shark was certainly among the possibilities. The saga's occasional references to people dying after meals, sometimes blamed on poisoning by enemies, were more likely cases of food poisoning from fermentation gone wrong. Lutefisk presents different, but equally real dangers. The preparation involved soaking dried stockfish in lye, sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide, caustic substances that could burn flesh. The lye was traditionally made from wood ash soaked in water, a process that yielded lye of variable strength. Too strong, and it damaged the fish beyond edibility. Too weak, and the process didn't work. The lye broke down the fish's proteins, transforming rock-hard dried cod into gelatinous, translucent flesh. But the lye had to be thoroughly rinsed out before eating. Inadequate rinsing meant you were eating caustic chemicals. Lye burns the mouth, throat, and stomach. Severe lye poisoning can be fatal. The historical record is maddeningly sparse on lye poisoning incidents, probably because such deaths were common enough not to merit special mention. But archaeological evidence suggests lutefisk-style preparations were widespread, meaning the risks were widely accepted. People knew that careless preparation could hurt or kill you, but they made it anyway because it turned inedible preserved fish back into something approaching food. Modern lutefisk is carefully regulated, but Viking-age lutefisk was made in conditions we'd consider shockingly dangerous. Lye concentration wasn't standardized. Soaking times were approximate. Rinsing was judged by taste and experience. Some batches undoubtedly contained enough residual lye to cause harm. Blood-based foods carried their own risks, primarily from the blood itself. Slaughtering animals to collect blood meant working with potentially contaminated material. If the animal had been sick, its blood carried pathogens. If the intestines were nicked during slaughter, fecal bacteria contaminated everything. Blood sausages and blood puddings provided essential nutrition, iron, protein, vitamins, but they had to be prepared carefully. The blood needed to be fresh and from a healthy animal. It had to be cooked thoroughly if cooked, or fermented properly if fermented. Failure meant illness. Archaeological analysis of Viking-age refuse has found evidence of various parasites that could be transmitted through undercooked meat and blood products. Trichinella spiralis, the parasite causing trichinosis, was probably common. Infection caused fever, muscle pain, and in severe cases, death. The Norse had no way to test for parasites. They just had to hope the animal was clean and the cooking was thorough. Tapeworms were endemic. Analysis of Viking-age latrines and coprolites shows heavy evidence of both fish tapeworms and beef tapeworms. These parasites came from eating raw or undercooked fish and meat, common when fuel was scarce, and cooking thoroughly meant using precious firewood. A person with a large tapeworm could eat adequately, yet still suffer malnutrition as the parasite consumed nutrients. Children with heavy parasitic loads showed stunted growth. Adults became anemic and weak. The most insidious aspect of parasites was their invisibility. You couldn't see them in the food. You couldn't taste them. You only knew you were infected when you saw segments in your feces or when malnutrition symptoms appeared months after infection. By then, the whole household might be infected from sharing contaminated food. Fermented milk products, while generally safer than fermented meat or fish, still carried risks. Skyr and cheese relied on bacterial fermentation, beneficial bacteria outcompeting harmful ones. But contamination could occur. If the milk came from a sick cow, if the containers weren't clean, if temperatures weren't right, harmful bacteria could dominate. Listeria monocytogenes, a bacterium that thrives in dairy products, causes listeriosis, fever, muscle aches, and in severe cases, sepsis and death. Pregnant women faced particularly high risks, as listeriosis could cause miscarriage. The Norse had no concept of bacterial contamination, just empirical knowledge that sometimes dairy products made people sick and sometimes they didn't. Cheesemaking introduced mold deliberately, but not all molds are benign. Some produce mycotoxins that cause liver damage and cancer. The Norse selected molds by trial and error. The blue-green molds that didn't kill people were encouraged. Others were scraped off. But mistakes happened. Archaeological analysis of preserved Norse cheese shows some contamination with potentially dangerous mold species. Preserved eggs, as mentioned earlier, were salmonella time bombs. Eggs stored in fat or buried in grain could harbor bacteria that multiplied slowly over winter. Break open a preserved egg in February, and you might get a nutritious food or a bacterial culture that would cause violent food poisoning. The Norse probably learned to test eggs, floating them in water, sniffing them carefully, but these tests weren't perfect. Salmonella poisoning causes severe diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration. In winter, when the body was already stressed from cold and limited nutrition, such illness could be fatal, especially for children and the elderly. Even if you survived, you'd lost precious calories and fluids at a time when replacement was difficult. The grain stores themselves harbored dangers. Stored grain attracted rodents and insects, but it also could develop fungal contamination. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, produces alkaloid compounds that cause ergotism, a condition that includes hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. Outbreaks of ergotism, called St. Anthony's fire in medieval times, caused periodic mass poisonings across Europe. The Norse may have experienced ergot poisoning without understanding its cause. Sagas occasionally mention people experiencing visions or strange behavior after meals, episodes sometimes attributed to magic or spiritual causes. Some may have been ergotism from contaminated grain. The fungus is visible, dark, elongated growths on grain kernels. But if you didn't know to look for it, or if lighting was poor in a dark storage room, contaminated grain could slip through. Eating ergot-contaminated bread caused vasoconstriction. The blood vessels constricted, cutting off circulation to extremities. In extreme cases, fingers and toes literally died and fell off, a horrifying condition that had no cure. Combined with winter cold, which also reduced circulation, ergot poisoning was particularly dangerous for Norse people. Salt itself, the primary preservative, posed toxicity risks when consumed in the quantities the Norse diet required. Their preserved foods were heavily salted, far beyond what we'd consider palatable today. While small amounts of salt are essential for health, excessive salt causes hypernatremia, elevated blood sodium levels that lead to neurological problems, kidney damage, and death. Acute salt poisoning probably wasn't common. It requires truly massive doses, but chronic overconsumption of salt certainly was. The Norse showed symptoms of high salt intake: thirst, frequent urination, and likely kidney problems. Analysis of Viking Age skeletal remains shows some evidence of kidney disease, though attributing this specifically to salt is difficult. The lack of fresh water further complicated salt consumption. In winter, water came from melted snow or ice, or from streams that might themselves have elevated mineral content. Drinking water to dilute dietary salt helped, but if water sources were limited or difficult to access, people might not drink enough, concentrating the salt in their systems. Mercury poisoning from seafood consumption was another invisible threat. Many fish and marine mammals accumulate mercury in their tissues, and predatory species like sharks accumulate particularly high levels. The Norse diet, heavy in fish, seal, and occasional whale meat, exposed them to chronic mercury. Mercury toxicity manifests gradually: tremors, memory problems, vision and hearing impairment, kidney damage. The Norse might have noticed these symptoms in people who ate large amounts of seafood, but they'd have no way to identify mercury as the cause. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age hair and bone samples shows elevated mercury levels in coastal populations compared to inland groups, confirming their seafood-heavy diet carried this risk. Children were particularly vulnerable to mercury neurotoxicity. Exposure during development could cause learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and motor skill impairment. A Norse child raised on a diet heavy in fermented shark and seal meat probably absorbed enough mercury to cause subtle but real neurological effects. Lead poisoning was less common than in some other ancient cultures. The Norse didn't use lead pipes or lead-glazed pottery extensively, but they did use lead for some applications, including weights for fishing nets and occasional ornamental items. Lead can leach into food from cookware or storage containers, and even small chronic exposures cause neurological damage, particularly in children. The cumulative toxic burden from multiple sources, mercury from fish, lead from various sources, mycotoxins from moldy food, parasites from undercooked meat, would have been substantial. People weren't dying quickly from single dramatic poisonings most of the time. Instead, they suffered chronic low-level toxicity that shortened lifespans and reduced quality of life in ways they couldn't understand or prevent. Starvation itself created dangerous situations where people consumed things they normally wouldn't. Historical accounts from later Scandinavian famines mention people eating everything from leather boots to moss scraped from rocks. While we can't confirm Vikings did exactly this, desperation in the worst winters probably pushed some to similar extremes. Leather, when boiled long enough, yields some nutrition from the collagen it contains. But leather was also treated with various chemicals for tanning, alum, oak bark tannins, sometimes more toxic substances. Eating heavily tanned leather could cause chemical poisoning on top of providing minimal nutrition. Yet in desperation, people tried it anyway. Tree bark, particularly the inner bark of pine and birch, was ground into flour to extend grain supplies in famine years. Bark provides some calories and nutrients, but is largely in cellulose, which humans can't digest efficiently. Eating too much bark caused intestinal blockages and constipation. But it filled stomachs when grain ran out, and sometimes that psychological comfort mattered as much as actual nutrition. Seaweed and kelp, common supplements in coastal diets, carried their own risks. Some seaweed species concentrate heavy metals from seawater, arsenic, cadmium, lead. Other species contain compounds that interfere with iodine absorption, potentially causing thyroid problems. The Norse probably learned which seaweeds were safest through trial and error, but individual tolerance varied, and what was safe for adults might harm children. One particularly dangerous practice was consuming fish or seal liver. Liver is nutritious, rich in vitamin A and other nutrients. But the livers of large predatory fish and marine mammals can contain vitamin A in toxic concentrations. Hypervitaminosis A causes liver damage, bone pain, skin problems, and in severe cases, death. Polar explorers in later centuries experienced this after eating polar bear or seal liver. Vikings consuming similar foods faced the same risks. The Norse probably learned to avoid certain livers or to eat them only in small quantities. But knowledge wasn't always passed down perfectly, and desperate people in winter might eat things they knew were risky simply because the alternative was hunger. Alcohol consumption, while not directly dangerous in the way poison is dangerous, created its own problems in winter survival contexts. Ale and mead provided calories and made the monotonous diet more palatable. But alcohol is a vasodilator. It makes blood vessels expand, which creates a sensation of warmth but actually increases heat loss. Drinking heavily, then going out into the cold could cause hypothermia. The sagas mention people freezing to death after drinking, usually presented as cautionary tales about the dangers of excess. But they reflect real risks. Alcohol impairs judgment and coordination, making winter travel more dangerous. It also provides empty calories that satisfy hunger temporarily without providing balanced nutrition, potentially worsening malnutrition if drinking replaced eating. Alcoholic fermentation itself carried contamination risks. If brewing containers weren't clean, if ingredients were moldy, if fermentation went wrong, the resulting alcohol could contain harmful compounds. Methanol contamination, which causes blindness and death, was probably rare but possible if fermentation conditions were unusual. Food storage methods, while ingenious, created environments where certain toxins could develop. Botulism, caused by Clostridium botulinum bacteria, thrives in low-oxygen environments like sealed barrels of preserved meat. The bacteria produces botulinum toxin, one of the deadliest natural substances known. Even tiny amounts cause paralysis and death. Properly salted meat prevented botulism growth, but if salt concentration was too low or if the seal wasn't perfect, conditions could allow the bacteria to multiply. The Norse would have had no way to detect this. Contaminated food looks and smells normal. They'd only know something was wrong when people who ate it began showing symptoms: blurred vision, difficulty swallowing, progressive paralysis. Botulism outbreaks were probably rare. The high salt content of most Norse preserved foods inhibited the bacteria, but they likely occurred occasionally, causing mysterious deaths that might be attributed to curses or supernatural causes. The combination of preservation methods and winter storage conditions created unique risks that modern food safety standards are designed to prevent. Barrels stored in cold but not freezing temperatures, opened and resealed multiple times as food was withdrawn, sometimes partially spoiled but eaten anyway because nothing else was available. All of these were vectors for contamination and poisoning. The Norse relationship with dangerous food was fundamentally different from ours. We can choose safe alternatives. They couldn't. When your options are eat the fermented shark that might poison you, or starve, you eat the shark and hope your ancestors taught you the right preparation methods. When your preserved meat smells slightly off, but you have 3 more months of winter ahead, you cook it thoroughly and eat it anyway. This calculated risk-taking extended to feeding children. Parents knew certain foods were dangerous but fed them to children anyway because the alternative was watching them starve. The decision to give a child fermented shark or heavily salted fish wasn't negligence. It was a desperate gamble that this particular batch would be safe enough, that this particular child would tolerate it, that you could keep them alive long enough to reach spring. The archaeological record provides glimpses of these tragedies. Children's graves from Norse settlements sometimes show evidence of malnutrition, parasitic infections, and conditions consistent with food poisoning or toxin exposure. Infant mortality was high. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children died before age 5. While many causes contributed, food-related illness was certainly among them. What's remarkable is not that some Norse people died from their food, but that so many survived. Their preserved foods, for all their dangers, worked well enough, often enough, to sustain a culture through countless winters. The knowledge systems they developed, which fish to ferment and which to dry, how to judge if preserved meat was still safe, when to eat something questionable and when to discard it, represented hard-won wisdom purchased with lives over many generations. Modern food safety is built on understanding the biological and chemical mechanisms that make food dangerous. The Norse had no such understanding, only empirical observation. When we prepare food this way, most people survive. When we prepare it that way, people die. This was sufficient to develop working preservation methods, but it wasn't sufficient to eliminate risk. Every meal from preserved stores was a small gamble. Usually, you won the bet. The food had been prepared correctly, stored properly, and remained safe. Sometimes, someone lost, got sick, suffered chronic poisoning, or died. But the alternative, not preserving food at all, guaranteed death for everyone. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Norse winter food. It was dangerous not because they were ignorant or careless, but because keeping it completely safe was impossible with their available technology and knowledge. They did the best they could with what they had, and what they had was food that would, by modern standards, come with warning labels and safety recalls. The Vikings ate food that could kill them because the alternative was certain death from starvation. Hakarl, lutefisk, heavily parasitized meat, mercury-laden fish, fermented products that might harbor botulism, salt concentrations that damaged kidneys. All of this was preferable to the alternative. Their winter diet was a testament to human adaptability and desperation in equal measure, proof that humans will eat almost anything if survival demands it, and evidence that sometimes, just surviving is victory enough. The barn attached to your longhouse is warm with animal breath and body heat. It's early November, the first serious snow has fallen, and you stand among your livestock taking inventory. 8 sheep, 3 goats, 2 cows, 1 pig, perhaps a dozen chickens. These animals are not pets. They're resources, calculations, living larders that must be carefully managed through the next 5 months. The decisions you make in the next few weeks will determine whether you eat adequately this winter or whether you starve. And the decisions are complex. Which animals do you slaughter now for meat? Which do you keep alive for other products? Can you feed them all? Should you feed them all? These questions have no easy answers, and getting them wrong means death. Start with the sheep. Sheep were the backbone of Norse animal husbandry, particularly in Iceland and Norway. They provided wool for clothing, meat for eating, milk for dairy products, and hides for leather. A good sheep was worth its weight in silver, and a breeding ewe that reliably produced healthy lambs was family treasure. But sheep eat constantly. Through winter, each sheep needed approximately 4 to 6 pounds of hay daily. 8 sheep meant 32 to 48 pounds of hay per day, or roughly 900 to 1,400 pounds per month. Over 5 winter months, you needed between 4,500 and 7,000 pounds of hay just for the sheep. That's multiple tons of hay that had to be cut, dried, and stored during summer. Did you harvest enough? If yes, you could keep all 8 sheep alive and benefit from their wool, milk, though production dropped in winter, and eventual lambs in spring. If no, you had to make brutal calculations. Which sheep were old or weak and unlikely to survive winter anyway? Which were poor wool producers? Which would make the best meat? The autumn slaughter was methodical and comprehensive. Nothing was wasted. The sheep was stunned, its throat cut to drain blood into barrels. The blood would become blood sausage or blood pudding, essential protein. The hide was carefully removed for leather. The meat was butchered into portions, some for immediate cooking, some for salting, some for smoking, some for drying. The internal organs each had uses. The liver and kidneys were eaten fresh. Organ meat is nutrient-dense and spoils quickly, so immediate consumption made sense. The stomach and intestines were cleaned thoroughly and used as sausage casings. The heart was meat. The lungs could be cooked or used in processed meats. The head was rendered for its meat, tongue, cheeks, and brain, all edible and nutritious. Bones were never discarded. They were boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of marrow and flavor for soup stock. Once cleaned, bones became tools, needles, buttons, game pieces. Even hooves and horns had value, rendered for glue or shaped into useful objects. A single adult sheep yielded approximately 40 to 50 pounds of meat, plus several pounds of organ meat, several pints of blood, a hide, and bones. If you slaughtered 4 of your 8 sheep, you had 160 to 200 pounds of meat to preserve, plus all the additional products. This needed to last months, supplementing but not replacing other food sources. The goats presented similar calculations, but with different parameters. Goats are hardy, able to survive on browse and scraps that sheep wouldn't eat. They provided milk almost year-round if well-fed, making them valuable alive. Goat meat is lean and preserves well, but lacks the fat content of mutton. The choice: keep them for milk or slaughter them for meat and free up their feed for other animals. Most Norse households kept at least one goat alive through winter for milk. The milk production dropped in cold weather and when feed was limited, but even a small amount of fresh milk was valuable. It could be consumed directly, made into cheese, or used to enrich porridge. A productive dairy goat might give a quart or 2 of milk daily, even in winter, providing essential nutrition for children. The cows were the most valuable and expensive animals to maintain. A cow needed substantially more food than a sheep, approximately 25 to 30 pounds of hay daily. 2 cows meant 50 to 60 pounds of hay per day, or 1,500 to 1,800 pounds per month. Over 5 months, you needed 7,500 to 9,000 pounds of hay just for the cows. This was a massive investment of summer labor in exchange for winter benefits. But those benefits were substantial. A healthy cow provided several gallons of milk daily in good conditions, though winter reduced this significantly. Still, even a gallon of milk daily meant butter, cheese, skyr, and whey, all forms of nutrition that could be preserved or consumed. Butter, heavily salted, kept for months. Cheese aged and improved. Skyr, that thick fermented milk product, was nearly shelf-stable. The calculus was stark. Keep the cows alive through winter at enormous feed cost, or slaughter them for hundreds of pounds of meat. Most households chose to keep at least one cow alive for dairy, slaughtering the other if they had to. Cow meat was prized, more of it than sheep, with substantial fat for rendering into tallow for candles and cooking. Slaughtering a cow was a major undertaking that involved the whole household and often neighbors as well. The animal was large, producing 400 to 600 pounds of meat depending on size and condition. This quantity of meat had to be processed quickly, butchered, salted, smoked, and stored before spoilage began. It was winter's bounty all at once, a massive influx of protein that represented security if preserved correctly. The cow's hide was especially valuable, large enough to make multiple pairs of shoes or be traded. The bones, massive and dense, provided marrow and long-lasting soup stock. The stomach was cleaned and used to store butter or cheese, or as a container for fermented products. Even the tail provided hair for rope making. The pig presented the simplest calculation. Pigs fatten quickly and efficiently, converting kitchen scraps and waste into high-quality protein and fat. A pig could be fed things humans couldn't eat: spoiled food, vegetable peels, whey left from cheese making it resource efficient. And pig fat, when rendered into lard, was liquid gold for cooking and preservation. Most pigs were slaughtered in autumn. There was little reason to keep them through winter since they didn't provide milk or wool. Their only value was as meat and fat, which preserved beautifully. A fattened pig could weigh 200 pounds or more, yielding substantial meat and perhaps 50 pounds of fat for rendering. Pig slaughter followed the same waste-nothing protocol. Blood into barrels, organs examined and used, meat butchered and preserved, fat rendered into lard and stored in barrels or bladders, intestines cleaned for sausage casings, head boiled for head cheese, meat and gelatin pressed together, surprisingly durable. Even the bladder, cleaned and dried, became a storage container. Pork, being fatty, was ideal for salting. The fat helped preserve the meat and made it calorie-dense. A barrel of salted pork lasted months and provided both protein and essential fats. Smoked ham and bacon were prized foods, special enough that they might be saved for midwinter celebrations. The chickens were managed differently. Unlike large livestock, chickens required minimal space and feed. They could scratch around the longhouse area, eating insects, seeds, and scraps. In winter, they moved into the barn or even into the living area of the longhouse. Their body heat helped warm the space, and they were protected from predators and cold. Chickens provided eggs, though production dropped dramatically in winter with reduced daylight and cold temperatures. A hen that laid 5 or 6 eggs weekly in summer might lay 1 or 2 per week in winter, or stop entirely. Still, those eggs were treasures, compact, nutritious, versatile food. Should you eat the egg now, or hope it hatches into another chicken in spring? Old hens that stopped laying were slaughtered for meat. Chicken was less meat than sheep or pig, but still valuable. The meat was typically boiled into soup, extracting every bit of nutrition. Even the feet were boiled for gelatin. Roosters, except for one kept for breeding, were usually slaughtered in autumn. They didn't lay eggs, they ate feed, and they became tough and stringy with age. The livestock that remained alive through winter required constant care. Daily feeding, watering, and cleaning of the barn were essential. In extreme cold, animals needed even more feed to maintain body heat. A cow that received inadequate nutrition might stop producing milk entirely. A pregnant ewe that starved might abort her lamb or die during delivery. Water was a particular challenge. Animals needed fresh water daily, but in deep winter, water sources froze. The Norse melted snow or broke through ice on streams to access water, then carried it to the barn. Heavy, cold work repeated every day regardless of weather or personal health. The barn itself required maintenance. Manure accumulated and needed periodic removal. Though in winter it was often left to build up, the decomposition generated heat. Too much accumulation, though, created unhealthy conditions and increased disease risk. Striking the right balance required constant attention. Disease among livestock was catastrophic. An illness that spread through your sheep or cattle meant losing animals you'd counted on for survival. The Norse had limited veterinary knowledge, mostly herbal remedies and prayers, so prevention through good care was critical. Sick animals were sometimes slaughtered immediately to salvage their meat before they died and the meat spoiled. The practice of bleeding livestock, taking small amounts of blood without killing the animal, was important for winter survival. A cup of blood from a cow or sheep provided valuable iron and protein without sacrificing the animal. This required skill to avoid harming the animal and careful hygiene to prevent infection at the bleeding site. Blood was mixed with oats or barley and cooked into puddings or used in sausages. This practice, documented in historical sources and continued in some traditional communities into recent times, turned livestock into renewable resources during winter. You could harvest small amounts of blood regularly, providing supplemental nutrition without reducing your breeding stock. It was a clever adaptation to extreme scarcity. The psychological complexity of living intimately with animals you knew you might eat cannot be understated. These sheep and cows and pigs weren't wildlife. They were animals you'd raised, cared for, maybe even named. Children played with the lambs in summer. The milk cow was a daily presence. And then autumn came, and decisions had to be made. The Norse cultural attitude toward livestock was pragmatic out of necessity. Animals were respected, but not sentimentalized. They had instrumental value. They kept you alive. Killing them was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply necessary. Teaching children this attitude was part of raising them in Norse culture. Children helped with slaughter, learning the skills they'd need as adults. Archaeological evidence shows that livestock management varied by region and wealth. Wealthy households kept more animals and could afford to winter more of them. Poor households might have only a few sheep and no cows at all. Their winter was proportionally more desperate. Skeletal analysis of animal remains from different Norse sites shows these disparities clearly. Analysis of butchery marks on bones reveals the Norse skill in maximizing meat yield. Clean cuts near joints show they understood anatomy and how to disarticulate carcasses efficiently. Cut marks on bones that would seem to have minimal meat suggest they were scraping off every bit, or boiling them so thoroughly that even sinew and connective tissue contributed to soup. The seasonal timing of slaughter shows up in archaeological deposits. Autumn layers contain abundant animal bones, evidence of mass slaughtering. Winter layers show fewer bones and more evidence of bone processing, boiling, breaking for marrow, even using crushed bone as fertilizer once every nutrient had been extracted. Some sites show evidence of communal slaughter, multiple households processing animals together. This made sense for efficiency and shared labor, but it also spread risk. If one family's preservation went wrong, they could trade labor or other goods for food from neighbors whose preservation succeeded. The Norse web of mutual obligation extended to livestock management. The spiritual aspect of slaughter shouldn't be ignored. The Norse had complex beliefs about animals and sacrifice. While the autumn slaughter was practical, not ritual, there were likely prayers or customs associated with it. Thanking the animal, invoking gods for successful preservation, asking for the family's survival through winter. These practices left little archaeological trace, but were probably widespread. Horses were special cases. Horses were valuable for transportation and weren't typically eaten except in ritual contexts or during extreme famine. Horse meat was associated with pagan practices, and as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, eating horse became taboo. But in pre-Christian times, or in desperate situations, horses were certainly consumed when necessary. Dogs and cats, while present in Norse households, were generally not eaten. Dogs were working animals, useful for hunting and guarding. Cats controlled rodents in grain stores. Eating them would be counterproductive. But the sagas mention dog and cat consumption during severe famines, suggesting that in the worst circumstances, any animal was potential food. The autumn livestock slaughter and winter management represented one of the most critical skills in Norse survival strategy. Get it right, slaughter the right animals, preserve the meat correctly, keep the remaining livestock alive and productive, and your family had a chance. Get it wrong, and you might eat well in November, but starve in March. The decisions required balancing immediate needs against future requirements. That breeding you might provide 2 lambs next spring, doubling your flock, but she's eating hay you might need to keep your cow alive for winter milk. The cow provides milk now, but slaughtering her would provide meat that could supplement inadequate grain stores. These trade-offs had no perfect answers, only best guesses based on experience and circumstances. The Norse became masters of this calculus through necessity. Those who calculated poorly didn't survive to pass their genes or knowledge forward. Those who managed their livestock skillfully through multiple winters became the elders whose advice was sought, the successful farmers whose methods were copied. Over generations, this selection pressure refined Norse animal husbandry into a sophisticated system adapted precisely to their harsh environment. Walking through that barn in November, looking at the animals that represented your family's survival, you weren't just a farmer doing chores. You were a strategist managing resources, a gambler calculating odds, and a survivor hoping your skill and luck would last one more winter. The animals looked back at you, unaware of their role in your survival, and you fed them their hay and made your plans. The snow is too deep. That's the first sign that this winter will be different, worse. By December, drifts reach the roof's edge, blocking doors and requiring tunnels to reach the barn. The cold is deeper too, penetrating even the longhouse walls despite the fire burning constantly. And when you check your winter stores in late January, your stomach clenches with fear. The barrels are half empty already, and March is still 2 months away. This is when the facade of Norse competence and careful planning crumbles. This is when you discover that sometimes, no matter how well you prepared, it's not enough. When the harvest was poor, or animals died unexpectedly, or preservation failed, or you're simply feeding more mouse than you anticipated, the mathematics of survival flip from challenging to impossible. The first stage of winter famine was rationing intensification. Meals shrank from small to tiny. Adults ate less so children could have enough to grow. The elderly voluntarily reduced their portions, though no one spoke directly about this self-sacrifice. The goal was to stretch remaining supplies as far as possible while everyone remained functional enough to work and survive. But functional deteriorated into barely functioning. Constant hunger gnawed at everyone. Stomachs ached. Energy evaporated. Simple tasks, carrying water, feeding animals, became exhausting ordeals. People moved slowly, conserving calories, speaking less to save energy. The longhouse fell into a kind of hibernation, everyone trying to simply endure until spring. Hunger changes behavior in predictable ways. Irritability increases. Everyone snaps at each other over nothing. Depression sets in. Why bother with anything when you're just slowly starving? Obsessive thoughts about food dominate every waking moment. People dream of feasts, of abundance, of eating until satisfied. They wake to cold and empty stomachs and the terrible knowledge that it will only get worse. Children suffered most visibly. They cried from hunger constantly at first, then fell into listless silence that was somehow worse. Their growth stopped. Their energy disappeared. They sat huddled by the fire, too weak to play. Parents watched this with helpless agony, knowing they couldn't provide what their children needed because it simply didn't exist. The second stage was supplementation through desperation. This meant eating things you normally wouldn't, stretching the definition of food to its absolute limit. Leather became edible. Boots, harnesses, straps, anything made from hide. The leather was cut into small pieces, boiled for hours to soften, then eaten. It provided minimal nutrition, mostly just filling stomachs temporarily, but psychologically it mattered. You were eating something, taking action against starvation rather than passively waiting to die. Tree bark became flour substitute. The outer bark was stripped away, and the inner bark, cambium layer, was scraped off, dried if possible, and ground as fine as possible. Mixed with what little grain remained, it could be made into a kind of bread, though bread is generous. It was gritty, bitter, largely indigestible, and caused digestive problems. But it filled space in the stomach. Lichens and moss scraped from rocks could be boiled into a kind of soup. They provided almost no nutrition, but added bulk. The Norse knew certain lichens were edible because reindeer ate them. If reindeer survived on them, humans might too, at least temporarily. Other lichens were toxic, and distinguishing between them in dim winter light, while starving and desperate led to mistakes and poisonings. Bones that had been boiled for soup were boiled again, and again, and again. Each boiling extracted less, but even trace amounts of marrow or minerals mattered. Eventually the bones were crushed and the fragments boiled, extracting truly the last possible nutrients. Some sources suggest bones were even ground into powder and eaten directly, though this seems like it would cause more digestive problems than it solved. The seed grain, carefully saved for spring planting, became an object of obsessive focus. Every day you didn't eat, it was a victory. Every day the temptation grew stronger. Should you eat it now to survive the next week? Gambling that you'll find replacement seed, or that spring will bring fish before you starve? Or should you preserve it and risk dying before spring, ensuring you can't plant even if you do survive? Some families ate their seed grain. Historical sources mention this as marking catastrophic famine. They ate their seed corn and knew they could not plant. It was a decision made when death from starvation seemed certain, and possible death next winter seemed preferable to certain death now. Sometimes it worked. People survived, found or traded for new seed, and continued. Sometimes it just delayed the inevitable. The third stage was considering the unthinkable, abandoning the homestead to seek help elsewhere, though travel in deep winter was extraordinarily dangerous. sending children to relatives, if any existed within reach, hoping someone else could feed them. Or, in the worst extremes, the darkest possibilities that sources hint at but rarely state explicitly: infanticide and sinicide, killing infants or elderly during extreme famine, is documented in other starvation contexts throughout history. The Norse sources are largely silent on this, which means either it didn't happen or it was too shameful to record explicitly. Indirect references exist. Old people who took to their beds and died conveniently when food ran low, infants who sickened during the worst winters. Were these natural deaths or desperate measures? We can't know for certain. What's documented more clearly is abandonment. Old people voluntarily leaving the longhouse during blizzards, ostensibly to perform some task, and not returning. Children sent to seek help from distant relatives and never heard from again. These may have been mercy deaths self-imposed to free up resources for others, or genuine attempts to seek help that failed. Either way, they represent the breaking point where families fractured under the pressure of starvation. Cannibalism, the absolute last resort, probably occurred but rarely. The Norse had strong taboos against it, and sources mention it only in the context of shipwrecks or the most extreme circumstances. But when you're starving, when everyone around you is dying, when a corpse represents hundreds of pounds of protein, the temptation existed. If it happened during the worst winters, it was never recorded, or records were destroyed as too shameful to preserve. What we do have are accounts from later Scandinavian famines that echo likely Viking Age experiences. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, well documented in European chronicles, saw people eating their own children, digging up graves to consume the dead, and committing murders for cannibalism. While this was after the Viking Age proper, the Norse faced similar conditions during their worst winters, and human behavior under extreme starvation is sadly consistent across cultures and times. Disease compounded starvation. Malnourished bodies had no immune reserves. Infections that would normally be minor became life-threatening. Respiratory illnesses, always common in winter, killed more easily when bodies were weakened. Diarrhea, from eating unsuitable foods or contaminated water, caused dehydration that couldn't be remedied because you couldn't spare fluids or energy. Scurvy became universal in late winter. With no fresh food since October, vitamin C stores depleted completely. Gums swelled and bled. Teeth loosened and fell out. Old wounds reopened. Energy disappeared entirely. In advanced stages, people became too weak to even feed themselves. Scurvy on top of starvation was often the final combination that killed people within sight.